They say betrayal cuts deepest when it comes from someone you love. But I didn't know it would feel like this, like the floor giving out from under me on a Tuesday morning. It started with an email, no subject line, just, please, report to conference room 4B at 9:00 a.m. I didn't think much of it at first. I had a presentation scheduled for later that day, a strategy pitch I'd been building for weeks. Maybe it was a last-minute prep meeting, I thought, but the quiet tension in the air as I walked through the office told a different story. Heads turned and quickly looked away. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Something was off, and then I saw them through the narrow hallway window. My younger sister, Sophie, sitting straight-backed in a tailored cream blazer. Nathan, our interim CEO, flanked her left, and Lena, my best friend of nearly a decade, stood with her arms crossed and an expression I couldn't place guilt, maybe, or worse, certainty. I paused outside the door, my hand on the cool metal handle. My stomach churned. Something instinctual warned me not to enter. But I did. "Grace, please sit," Sandra from HR said quickly, avoiding my eyes. The air in the room was stale and heavy with anticipation. My chair had already been pulled out for me. Nathan began speaking, his voice oddly formal. "We're here to inform you that effective immediately, your employment with Vaughn Co is terminated." The words hit like a slap. I blinked, trying to understand what I had just heard. Terminated. I echoed, "On what grounds?" His answer came with the cold precision of someone reading a prepared script. "We've received reports of professional misconduct, violations of confidentiality, and an ongoing pattern of disruptive behavior. We'll be sharing the documentation shortly." I looked at Sophie, her eyes flicked away. And Lena. She couldn't meet my gaze at all. It was all choreographed. The folders on the table, the silence, the legal rep in the corner who said nothing, but held a briefcase full of accusation. It wasn't just a meeting, it was an execution. Have you ever walked into a room thinking you were safe, only to discover you were the only one who hadn't read the script? If you've ever been blindsided by someone you thought would stand beside you, if you've ever been quietly erased by people you helped rise, drop your city and the time you're watching in the comments below. I want to hear your story. And if you've ever wanted to see how someone takes betrayal and turns it into fire, subscribe and stay with me. Because what happened next changed everything. That morning, I left the office with a box in my hands and the ghost of trust in my chest. I wasn't just fired, I was erased. But what they didn't know, what not a single one of them in that room realized, was that I still owned the very building they were standing in. This isn't a story about revenge. It's about remembering who you are when everyone tries to forget you. Long before the boardrooms and betrayal, before the perfectly wrapped terminations and doctored emails, I was just Grace, quiet, cautious, the older sister who always got things done without being asked. Sophie was the golden one, always had been. Our family dinners were a study in contrast. Sophie, with her sparkling eyes and perfectly timed jokes, commanded attention like she was born on stage. Mom and Dad would hang on every word, laughing before she even finished her stories. Meanwhile, I'd sit at the end of the table, half listening, half hoping someone might ask how my robotics competition went. They never did. It wasn't that they didn't love me. At least I don't think so. It's just that my wins were expected. Straight A's. Of course, scholarship naturally, first job offer while still in college. Just doing what was typical for me. But when Sophie passed her first driving test on the second try, we went out for steak and chocolate cake. I remember one night in high school, I was 15 studying at the kitchen table for my calculus midterm. Sophie stormed in crying because she got a C on her literature project. My mother sat beside her for hours, consoling her, stroking her hair, making tea. No one even noticed I'd aced my practice exam and was too scared to say anything. That was the rhythm of my childhood, doing well quietly while Sophie stumbled loudly, always with a safety net. I learned to solve things on my own. I fixed my own bike tires, filed my own FAFSA, got my first job scooping ice cream while Sophie spent her weekends at lake houses with friends. But somewhere deep down, I still loved her. Because when you're the older sister, you don't just love, you protect. You guide, even when no one asks you to. College only widened our gap. I went to a state school on a merit scholarship, double majored in business and behavioral economics, and worked 2 part-time jobs. Sophie bounced. Art major, then psychology, then hospitality. Each year, she seemed less interested in building a future and more interested in finding another shortcut. And yet somehow, the praise still flowed in her direction. Sophie's discovering herself, my dad would say. Not everyone figures it out early like you, Gracie. I hated how much that nickname hurt Gracie. It used to make me feel special, but over time, it started to sound like a consolation prize. There was one winter break where Sophie forgot to pick me up from the airport. I waited 3 hours in a snowstorm, finally calling a cab. When I walked in the door freezing and furious, Mom just said, "She's not used to responsibility like you are. Be patient with her." I realized something that day: my reliability had made me invisible. The more capable I became, the less they noticed. The more I achieved, the more they assumed I didn't need support. Sophie was the star, I was the scaffolding. I tell you all this not for sympathy, but because the seeds of betrayal are often planted in the soil of quiet resentment. You think it's just favoritism, just a phase. But when it keeps happening year after year, it becomes something else. Something that hardens inside you. So when I helped Sophie get her first job at Vaughn Co., it wasn't just charity, it was hope, a last attempt to rewrite the story. I thought maybe here she'll see what I've built and find her own path beside me, not over me. What I didn't realize then was this: when someone is handed everything, they often don't stop to ask who paid the price. If you had met me 5 years ago, you wouldn't have seen a future CEO. You'd have seen a woman sitting cross-legged on her apartment floor, surrounded by takeout containers and open spreadsheets, trying to build something from absolutely nothing. I was 27 when I met Clarissa Vaughn. She was already a legend by then, the kind of founder people whispered about in MBA case studies. Sharp, unapologetic, impossible to impress, which is probably why I didn't try. We met by accident. I was giving a data presentation at a marketing conference, nothing glamorous, just a breakout room filled with mid-level strategists and board execs checking emails. Clarissa sat in the back, silent. I didn't even know she was there until afterward when she walked up and said, "You see things people miss?" That one sentence changed my entire trajectory. Within weeks, I was working alongside her. Not as an executive, not yet. She made me start at the bottom, an analyst in her strategy lab. We worked late, we argued often, but I loved it. Every impossible deadline, every skeptical client, every coffee-fueled brainstorm where she made me defend every insight like I was on trial. She sharpened me. Over time, she began to confide more. Most people think marketing is about getting attention, she once told me. But real marketing, it's about trust. Get that right, and the rest follows. 16 months in, she called me into her office uncharacteristically quiet. "I'm dying, Grace." I couldn't speak. "Pancreatic, stage 4, maybe 6 months." I sat down hard. She looked at me, eyes still fierce. "I don't want a legacy of PowerPoints and buzzwords. I want someone who actually cares, who knows this company from the roots up." I thought she was saying goodbye. Instead, she handed me an envelope. Inside were preliminary documents transferring majority ownership of Vaughn Co. to me pending a condition. The next 3 years, my ownership would remain confidential. I would work inside the company as any other employee, earn promotions, prove myself, and only the board's legal counsel would know the truth. "Why hide it?" I asked. "Because you'll learn more when no one's trying to impress the boss," she said simply. "You'll see the cracks before the paint goes up, and when you take the reins, you won't be guessing, you'll know exactly what this place needs." She passed away 2 weeks later. I honored everything she asked. I interviewed for the strategy director role like any outsider, went through 3 rounds, presented my portfolio, accepted the offer with a handshake and a nervous smile, even though I technically already owned the company I was joining. That's the thing about real power. It doesn't always announce itself. For the next 3 years, I worked harder than anyone. I didn't flaunt credentials. I didn't name drop Clarissa. I earned my seat. I built trust. I cultivated clients who saw me as a quiet storm, someone who delivered results, not drama. Only one person at Vaughn Co. ever knew the truth: Jordan Reeve, the firm's legal advisor. He never treated me differently, just guarded the paperwork and occasionally gave me a nod that said, "Soon." And it would have stayed that way, clean, seamless, quiet, if I hadn't let emotion cloud my judgment the day I brought Sophie in. I told myself it was a kindness, a gesture of sibling trust. But the truth. Deep down, I wanted her to see what I'd built. I wanted her to understand who I had become. That was my mistake, because you can build an empire in silence, but all it takes is the wrong person at your table to burn the foundation. The morning Sophie walked into the Vaughn & Co. offices as a newly hired content coordinator, she looked every bit the part: polished blouse, professional smile, and that signature charm she wielded like a scalpel. I watched her beam as I introduced her to the team, my heart full of cautious pride. For once, it felt like we were standing on even ground. "I can't believe you pulled this off," she whispered as we rode the elevator together that first day. "I owe you grace. Big time." I believed her. I wanted to. That first week was smooth. Sophie asked questions, shadowed meetings, brought me coffee, unprompted. She seemed eager to learn, respectful even. My heart softened. I started imagining a new kind of sibling bond, one not built on childhood comparisons or family dinners laced with tension, but on shared ambition and mutual respect. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the dynamic shifted. The first time I noticed, it was small. A client presentation she helped prepare had a few data points I'd given her casually over lunch. She presented them confidently without attribution. I didn't say anything. Maybe she forgot, maybe it was unintentional. Then came the missed deadlines, the half-finished drafts. I covered for her thinking it was just the learning curve. I stayed late finishing projects she'd abandoned. She always thanked me eyes wide with gratitude like a child avoiding punishment. "I'm still figuring out my rhythm," she'd say, sighing dramatically. "You're just so good at this. It comes naturally to you." I took the bait every time. But while her deliverables remained shaky, her social rise was meteoric. Within a month, Sophie had everyone wrapped around her finger. She brought cupcakes on Wednesdays, remembered birthdays, organized trivia nights at the bar across the street. Her desk became the hub of casual chatter and lunchtime planning. And then there was Nathan. He started swinging by her workspace often. Too often. What began as casual mentorship became private meetings. I saw them laughing together in the break room, standing a little too close. I was never invited to those meetings. Not anymore. I brushed it off at first. Sophie had always been likable. Maybe it was good for her confidence. Maybe I was just being protective. But then Lena, my best friend, my confidant, began to drift. It started subtly. She canceled one of our Thursday night wine dates, then another. Sophie invited me to a networking thing she'd text. Rain check. I told myself it was fine, but I started noticing glances between them during meetings. Jokes I didn't understand. Whispered comments that stopped when I entered the room. Once during a brainstorm, I referenced a strategy model I'd created. And Lena cut in. "Didn't Sophie already suggest something like that last week?" No, she hadn't. And yet, I stayed quiet because I didn't want to believe what was becoming clear. I thought I was being paranoid. I thought, maybe I'm just tired. Maybe I'm imagining things. I wasn't. The breaking point came during our quarterly pitch for Elevate Athletics, our biggest sportswear client. Sophie had a small part in the presentation outlining the content calendar. The night before, she called me in. A panic. "I don't think my section is strong enough," she said. "Can you just glance at it? Maybe add a few insights?" I spent 4 hours rebuilding her entire segment analytics projections, custom visuals. I emailed it to her before bed, even added, "Use whatever you like." She used all of it, word for word. And when the client praised the insight into suburban millennial engagement, Sophie smiled and said, "I've been studying consumer behavior in my free time." She had removed my name from the contributor slide entirely. I waited. I waited for her to look back at me across the room, to give me a nod, a blink, something. She didn't. Later that night, I sat at my desk and stared at my screen, empty of emotion, until I noticed something else. Folders were missing. Weeks of research. Gone. I called IT. They said it was a glitch, unrecoverable. That's when I knew this wasn't incompetence. It was infiltration. I had let Sophie in through the front door. I had handed her my playbook. And she had used it to burn the field behind me. Lena Hart was the kind of friend who knew your coffee order before you walked into the shop. The kind who showed up with soup when you were sick, stayed on the phone while you cried, and memorized the names of every cousin you rarely spoke to. We met during my second week at Vaughn Co, both assigned to an impossible project with half the timeline and zero support. We survived it together with cold pizza, bad coffee, and a bond that felt unshakable. Or so I thought. She was the first person I told about Clarissa. Not the ownership secret, never that, but about her mentorship, her illness, the legacy she hoped to leave behind. Lena had held my hand through the grief. She had toasted Clarissa's name with me over wine the night I signed the first papers. "You're going to change this place," she said, clinking her glass against mine. Now she barely looked me in the eye. It started with little things, missed check-ins, ignored messages. "I'm just swamped," she'd say, brushing it off with a half smile. But then she stopped looping me into project threads, stopped defending my proposals in meetings, and worse, started questioning them. I remember the first time it happened. We were in a creative strategy session. I laid out a plan I'd been refining for days one Lena had seen and praised during prep. But in front of the team, she said, "I'm not sure this aligns with where we're headed." No warning, no context, just the slow pull of a rug beneath my feet. I confronted her later. What was that? Her expression was unreadable. Things are shifting. We're all adjusting. Shifting. Adjusting. Words that meant nothing and everything. The next time I asked her to grab lunch, she said she was meeting with Sophie instead. She just gets it, Grace. She's fresh, light. You're so heavy these days. Heavy, like a burden, like something to step around. I tried to tell myself it wasn't what it looked like, that Lena was just overwhelmed, that she wasn't picking sides. But then came the email leak. An internal draft. I had written a brutally honest assessment of a client's outdated branding circulated without context. Someone had forwarded it out of the planning folder and dropped it into a general thread. My name was on it. The client saw it. We nearly lost the account. The only people with access to that folder were me and Lena. When I brought it up, she didn't even try to deny it. "You're too protective of your ideas," she said. "That kind of territorial mindset is toxic. Maybe this was the universe pushing you to share more." I stared at her in disbelief. "You leaked it, then tried to sell it as a growth opportunity." "I didn't leak anything," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "But even if I had, maybe you needed a wake-up call." And there it was, the betrayal wrapped in faux concern, the language of sabotage disguised as coaching. I began tracing the timeline. Her shift in behavior had aligned perfectly with Sophie's sudden rise. They were inseparable, now collaborating on special projects Nathan assigned directly. I was never told what those projects were, but I knew what they weren't mine. One Thursday night, the kind we used to spend drinking wine on her balcony, I saw a photo pop up on Sophie's Instagram. Lana, Sophie, and Nathan, drinks in hand, laughing under string lights with the caption, "Dream Team Vibes." That was the moment I felt something break. This wasn't just about professional drift. This was personal. The woman who once sat beside me during the darkest hours of my life was now sitting beside the very people who were methodically erasing me. I wanted to scream, to confront her, to demand an explanation. Instead, I opened a new document and began taking notes. Because if friendship could be weaponized, then memory could be too. Some betrayals feel like thunderclaps, sudden, sharp, unmistakable. Others arrive slowly, like a fog creeping in unnoticed until you can't see 2 steps ahead. What happened next wasn't a blow. It was erosion. It started with silence. Emails I should have been copied on stopped arriving. Meeting invites I once received automatically were now forgotten. At first, I chalked it up to oversight. People get busy, systems glitch. But then I overheard Sophie in the hallway whispering to Lena, "Just loop Grace in later. It's easier that way." Later never came. I began walking into conference rooms only to find decisions already made. Strategies I had drafted were presented as collaborative teamwork, though I hadn't even been consulted. A proposal I'd built over weeks tailored for a boutique tech client was suddenly reassigned to Sophie. "She's got the energy we're looking for," Nathan said, smiling like it was a compliment. I kept my voice steady. "She's been here 5 months. She's a fast learner," he replied, already turning away. That's when I started keeping track. Not just what was missing, but who was making it disappear. I set up alerts on project folders, installed version trackers, kept a paper journal of every odd change, every missing file, every proposal stripped of my name. Quietly, carefully, like planting flags no one else could see. The hardest part wasn't the work, it was the gaslighting. "Maybe you're just tired. Are you sure you weren't invited? I thought I saw your name. You're being overly sensitive." And always, Sophie didn't mean it that way. One afternoon, I walked into a meeting where my analytics report had been rebranded under Lena's name. Same graphs, same conclusions, even the typos I hadn't fixed yet. "Great work," Lena, Nathan said. "Exactly what we needed." I looked at her. She didn't flinch. The final straw came with the office move. I had worked from the same corner cubicle for 3 years. It was modest but efficient, a space filled with personal touches, client notes, and quiet focus. I returned from a client lunch one day to find my desk empty, my things in a box, a sticky note taped to the side, "Facilities moved your station, ask HR." Sophie had taken my space. When I asked Sandra from HR why, she blinked as if the answer was obvious. "Sophie's been given a direct client portfolio. She needs a private office for calls." I stared at her. "I handle 3 times as many clients." She didn't respond. She didn't have to. My voice no longer mattered, and worse, Sophie knew it. That week, she was promoted to junior brand manager, bypassing company protocol. It was the kind of advancement that usually required at least a year of documented performance client metrics and leadership feedback, none of which she had. But suddenly, she had a team, a title, a door with her name on it, her name. And me, I was left watching the same people who once relied on me now defer to her. At a Friday happy hour, I walked in to see Sophie leading a toast. To fresh eyes and fearless ideas, she said, glass raised high. No one looked at me, except Marcus. He stood near the bar, his expression unreadable. After the clinking died down, he approached me. Something feels off, he murmured. The way things are shifting. People acting like you don't exist anymore. I gave a small nod, unwilling to break in public. You're not imagining it? He added, voice low. Just be careful. That night, I stayed in the office long after everyone else had left. I turned on my lamp, opened my laptop, and made a copy of everything. Emails, timelines, server logs. I was done hoping someone would notice the truth. It was time to gather proof. It happened on a Tuesday. Funny how something as shattering as the end of your career can happen on a day that starts so ordinarily, no thunder, no warning, just coffee with too much cream and a half-written to-do list. I got the email at 8:43 a.m. Subject conference room 4B, 9:00 a.m. from Sandra Evers, HR. There was no explanation, just that. My stomach twisted. I hadn't done anything wrong. I knew that. But knowing and feeling are rarely aligned when your instincts start screaming at you. I walked to the conference room like a woman headed to sentencing. Outside the glass, I saw the cast already assembled. Sophie seated confidently with a folder in her lap. Nathan at the head of the table, jaw tight. Lena off to the side scrolling her phone like this was just another item on her calendar. And Sandra neutral as a notepad. Grace Nathan said as I stepped in, please sit. The moment I touched the chair, I knew. We've reviewed a series of serious concerns. Nathan began flipping through a folder he clearly hadn't read himself. Reports of unprofessional behavior, misuse of company resources, and creating a toxic work environment. I blinked. Excuse me? You've been warned previously, he continued, but there hasn't been improvement. I turned to Sandra. What warning? She looked down at her hands. Then Sophie stood connecting her tablet to the projector. I remember thinking how steady her fingers were. No shaking, no hesitation. Just the cold precision of someone delivering a rehearsed monologue. I found these by accident, she said, voice soft wounded. I was copied on a client thread and I couldn't believe what I saw. A flurry of screenshots appeared on the screen, emails from me, but doctored. Selectively edited to twist jokes into insults, critique into cruelty. I recognized my tone, but not the meaning. I didn't want to believe it. Sophie added, eyes glassy. But then I found the expense reports. Fake spreadsheets flashed up, receipts inflated, flight paths that never happened. It was elaborate, impressive, even in its orchestration. My voice caught. These aren't real. These are fabrications. We've verified the inconsistencies, Nathan said, sliding a document toward me. And unfortunately, the pattern is undeniable. Then Lena spoke. I wanted to give Grace the benefit of the doubt, she said gently, looking not at me, but the board lawyer. But over the past few months, her behavior has become erratic. She's been paranoid, possessive, even hostile. She once told me she'd ruin Sophie's career if she didn't know her place. That conversation never happened. But the delivery, calm, clinical, carefully unprovable, was devastating. I sat still, breathing shallow. I looked at Lena, my friend. My former friend. She didn't blink. Nathan pushed a final paper across the table. This is a standard severance and NDA. 2 weeks pay in exchange for your discretion. Sandra reached for the paperclip, but I didn't take it. Instead, I stood, slowly, quietly. You think this is over, I said. Nathan's smile faltered. No, I continued looking each of them in the eye. It's just the part where you think you've won. I turned and left the room. Security was waiting outside. One of them, I recognized Tommy. He used to bring me his daughter's Girl Scout cookie forms every year. He looked down, unsure if he should say something. It's fine, I said, offering him the ghost of a smile. They think I'm powerless now, and maybe I was on paper. But papers lie, because what none of them knew, what not one of them suspected, was that I still held 72% of Vaughn Co, and their names were still inked in contracts that I now had every right to review. By the time I reached the parking lot, my box of belongings in hand, the grief had receded. What rose in its place wasn't rage. It was resolve. They had fired the woman who owned the company, and I was going to make them remember exactly who I was. I didn't go home that day I went to war. The apartment transformed within hours. My dining table vanished under layers of documents, legal filings, ownership agreements, copies of emails, and timelines of every whisper, every meeting. I was excluded from every project, stripped of my name. The corkboard over my desk turned into a web of colored threads tracking connections between Sophie, Lena, Nathan, and the dominoes they thought would never fall. I didn't cry. There was no room for that now. My first call was to someone I hadn't spoken to in nearly a year. Jonathan Wells, a corporate attorney with a reputation for precision and zero tolerance for bullshit. He answered on the second ring. "Jonathan, it's Grace Blackwell," I said. "I'm calling in that favor." A pause, "Then tell me everything." I did. From the ownership clause Clarissa had structured to the timeline of the betrayal. The false accusations, the meeting, the severance bribe, everything. When I finished, he exhaled like someone who just opened a vault of weapons. They fired the majority shareholder without knowing it. They think I was just strategy lead. His voice sharpened. Then they've just handed you every ounce of leverage you'll need. We planned it in phases, quietly, meticulously. First, preserve the evidence, secure backups of all files, emails, and client contracts. Second, identify which board members would be receptive to a private meeting. And third, most critical, prepare the formal declaration of ownership now legally ready for public record. Timing is key, Jonathan said. If we go too early, they'll cover their tracks. Too late, and they might install new protections. You need to move while they still think you're out of the game. That night, I poured myself a glass of red wine and stared at my old cubicle keycard, still active. They'd forgotten to revoke it in the rush of their own performance. So I went back, at midnight, slipped through the side entrance. No lights, just the hum of servers and the buzz of lies still floating in the air. I downloaded server logs, traced document edits, captured access history, and then I found the chart. A new org structure, scheduled to be announced at the next company town hall. Sophie listed as Director of Brand Strategy, effective in 6 weeks. Her projected title by year's end Vice President. I kept digging. Nathan's bonus contract, linked directly to organizational streamlining metrics. Translation firing high-salaried staff to boost short-term profitability. And Lena email chains with Sophie discussing how to gradually isolate Grace without direct conflict. One line stopped me cold. Make her seem difficult, push the emotional angle. If we can frame her as unstable, Nathan will be on board. They weren't guessing. They had planned every step. What they didn't plan for was me still being inside the system. By Friday, I had spoken to 4 board members individually. Jonathan advised this strategy. The element of surprise works in your favor. Get their ears before Nathan gets their defenses. Each call began the same way. There's something you need to see, privately, off record for now. The reactions were predictable. Shock, skepticism, then a rapid shift to concern when they saw the documents, emails, falsified financial data, and the ownership transfer signed by Clarissa herself 3 years earlier. I never liked Townsend, one board member muttered. Too slick? Why didn't you come forward sooner, another asked. Because Clarissa asked me to wait, I answered. She believed true leadership isn't about being seen. It's about understanding every layer before taking the top seat. I honored that, until they gave me no choice. We scheduled the emergency board meeting for Monday morning. I didn't sleep much Sunday night. Instead, I rehearsed in front of the mirror. Not just the facts, the tone, the control, the moment of reveal. Before we continue, there's something important you should know. I'm not just a former employee of Vaughn Co. I'm its majority owner. I laid out the navy blue suit I had purchased 2 years ago but never worn, saved for a day I wasn't sure would ever come. And when morning broke, I stood in the full-length mirror, shoulders, back voice steady, and whispered 3 words that no one else would hear, but that would define everything to come. Now watch me. The moment I stepped into that boardroom, everything slowed like time was holding its breath. Richard Nathan was already speaking when I entered, gesturing confidently toward a screen filled with projections and buzzwords. As you can see, he was saying this proposed restructure would streamline operations and elevate brand visibility. The board sat in their usual semicircle, some nodding, some distracted. Sophie sat at the far wall, her blazer impeccable, a pen between her fingers. Lena flanked her right, typing something on her phone. No one noticed me at first. Then I cleared my throat. I'm going to need you to stop Nathan. Every head turned. He blinked. Excuse me? You no longer have the authority to speak for this company. A ripple passed across the room. I'm sorry, said Janet Leland, the board chair. And you are. I stepped forward, slowly placing a thick black portfolio on the table. My name is Grace Blackwell, I said. And for the past 3 years, I've been the majority owner of Vaughn Co. Silence, pure crystalline silence. Then Jordan Clarissa's old attorney, who had kept the secret as promised, nodded solemnly. She's telling the truth. The structure was drafted by Clarissa Vaughn before her passing. It's been legally binding since the day she signed it. The room moved like molasses. I watched the color drain from Sophie's face. Lena sat bolt upright. Nathan's mouth opened, but no words came. I pulled out copies of the original ownership documents, the confidentiality clause, and the succession plan Clarissa had handwritten in the margins. This wasn't about hiding, I said. It was about understanding. Clarissa believed in leadership from within, not from above. Nathan surged to his feet. This is absurd. A marketing strategist suddenly owns the company based on some buried agreement. I met his eyes evenly. I wasn't just a strategist. I was always more than what you saw. I connected my laptop to the projector. For the next hour, I said calmly, "You're going to see exactly what I've seen over the past year." What followed was a masterclass in calm fury. I showed doctored emails, server access logs, data manipulation. I displayed financial inconsistencies tied directly to Nathan's bonus structure. I presented Sophie's rapid promotion timeline, complete with recommendations forged in her own words. Lena's email threads echoed behind them like a haunting refrain. This wasn't a misunderstanding, I said. It was a coordinated effort to remove me. The evidence is undeniable. They squirmed. Sophie whispered to Lena. Nathan kept cutting in. That's out of context, but the damage was done. When the final slide went dark, the boardroom stayed quiet. Then Janet spoke. I believe we've seen enough. She turned to Jordan. Is there any legal reason Ms. Blackwell cannot assume full executive control immediately? No, he said. She is and always has been the legal majority stakeholder. Janet nodded once. Then to the rest of the room, effective immediately, Nathan Townsend is terminated. Ms. Sophie Blackwell and Ms. Lena Hart will be suspended, pending a full investigation. Security will escort them from the premises. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same hallway, the same security guards, the same cardboard box of shame. Only this time, they weren't walking away with power. They were walking away with consequences. Sophie tried to say something to me, not the board. I didn't mean, but I raised a hand. No, you meant it. Every move, every lie, every stolen credit, you meant it. You just didn't think I'd still be standing when it caught up to you. She froze. Her lip trembled, but I didn't soften, because forgiveness doesn't come without accountability. When they were gone, Janet turned to me. What do you plan to do next? I looked around at the faces of those still in the room, some shocked, some relieved. I rebuild, I said, and this time I do it right. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of restructuring. I cleaned house, installed transparent reporting systems, repaired client relationships, some personally. I promoted Marcus, one of the few who'd quietly stood by me. I reconnected with Clarissa's old advisors and asked for honest feedback, even when it stung. I also took time for myself. Therapy, journaling, long walks without my phone. Because rebuilding the company was only half the battle. The rest was rebuilding me. 8 months had passed since the morning I reclaimed Vaughn Co, since I sat at that boardroom table and revealed the truth no one saw coming. Some days, it still didn't feel real, but the changes around me were tangible, undeniable. The office felt different now, not because of paint or furniture, but because of energy. People stopped whispering in corners. Meetings became collaborative again. New hires weren't judged by who they knew, but what they brought to the table. The rot was gone and something hopeful had taken root. One of my first executive orders was to implement a whistleblower protection program, something I wished had existed when the walls began closing in on me. We created anonymous reporting channels, reviewed all employee evaluations, and rebuilt our client transparency agreements from the ground up. The reaction from our partners was better than I had hoped. Most agencies would have buried this, one longtime client said. You brought it into the light. That's who we want to work with. But internally, quietly, I was still healing. There were scars from what happened. Not just professionally, but personally. Trust once broken doesn't rebuild in a quarter. It takes time and boundaries. My parents tried to smooth it over after the news broke. She didn't mean to hurt you, my mother said over the phone one afternoon. Maybe she just got caught up. She got caught up for 8 months, I replied, my voice level. That's not confusion, that's a choice. Eventually, I made peace with them, not with what they believe, but with what I would no longer fight to prove. You can have a relationship with me, I told them, or with her, but I won't share space with someone who tried to destroy me. It was a hard boundary, but a necessary one. As for Lena, she sent emails, voicemails, even a handwritten letter delivered to my office. I was weak. I let ambition override loyalty. I don't expect forgiveness. And she was right. I didn't forgive her. Not because I held on to anger, but because I no longer held on to her. Closure didn't come in dramatic confrontations. It came quietly through acceptance and in choosing not to reopen doors that had already revealed what lay behind them. One day, while working late, I found a photo tucked behind an old file in Clarissa's drawer. It was a snapshot of her standing in front of the original Vaughn Co building, weathered but proud, smiling at something just beyond the frame. I turned it over. In her looping cursive, she'd written, "Leadership isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about knowing when to stay, when to stand, and when to build something no one else sees yet." That night, I walked out of the office and didn't take any work home. I went to dinner with friends who knew me outside of titles. I laughed harder than I had in months because justice had been served, not with vengeance, but with truth. And rebuilding my life wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about proving to myself that I could lead with integrity, even when I'd been surrounded by deception. Vaughn Co is thriving now. We've been featured in multiple industry publications for our culture turnaround and ethical leadership initiatives. I don't mention what happened unless someone asks. When they do, I tell them this. Sometimes the people closest to you don't just betray you, they teach you exactly how strong you are. That's not revenge. That's justice. And sometimes that's more than enough. When Grace Blackwell was unexpectedly fired from the company she helped build, it felt like the end of everything. Her sister, her best friend, and her boss had orchestrated a quiet coup, fabricating evidence, spreading lies, and leaving her reputation in ruins. But what they didn't know was that Grace had a secret. For 3 years, she had quietly been the majority owner of Vaughn Co, chosen by its late founder to one day lead with wisdom, not ego. Instead of lashing out, Grace gathered proof, sought legal counsel, and executed a plan that would expose the truth. In a boardroom showdown, she revealed her ownership and dismantled the false narratives built against her. The fallout was swift. Her betrayers escorted out, her authority restored. But Grace didn't just retake her seat. She redefined leadership. From rebuilding company ethics to establishing a culture of transparency, she turned a story of betrayal into one of transformation. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming power with grace and healing without bitterness. If you've ever been cast aside, misunderstood, or betrayed by those closest to you, know this. You don't have to become cruel to survive cruelty. You just have to remember who you are. And sometimes, that quiet knowing is louder than any shout. Have you ever experienced something similar? Share your story in the comments. I read everyone. If this journey resonated with you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with someone who needs to be reminded that setbacks can become setups for something far greater. Drop your city and local time in the comments. I want to know where you're listening from. Because no matter where you are in your journey, you're not alone. Thank you for watching. You're stronger than they think. And your story isn't over.